Okay, I can see everybody now. So let's get started. It's noon. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back for those who were here last time, and welcome all the newcomers. We hope you're doing well and are ready for some fantastic linguistics today. So I will introduce the series, remind you of the idea behind the series, and then Clay will introduce our speaker of the day. So Reflections is the new talk series that Clay and I organized last year. And the point is to celebrate generative syntax in the generative tradition, and specifically focus on its foundations and developments. And we're doing this by inviting some longstanding scholars to reflect on their early work from a current perspective. And by doing that, they are tracing the history of the field for us and letting us learn from them about what it was like for them to make those developments. Last fall, we had a fantastic talk by Robert May, who started us off. We'll post a link to YouTube where it is now, if you haven't seen it yet, so you can see that. And today, we're continuing with our second talk. And Clay will introduce our speaker in a moment, but before I give it over to him, let me go over just a few housekeeping matters. If you could please turn on your cameras so that we could see your friendly faces. And also try to stay muted throughout the presentation, unless you're asking a question, which we're saving all the questions for the end of the presentation. And we'll give early career people a preference for asking the questions first. Also, try to keep the chat, conversations in the chat to the minimum, because it kind of distracts the speaker and the viewers. So try to not monopolize the chat too much. I think, let's see, did I forget anything? Yeah, that's all. So Clay, it's over to you.
All right, over to me. Kleanthus Groman, or Clay, as Lydia likes to call me, for my previous life. Happy Lunar New Year 2024, everyone. As some of you may know, monkeys will have a smooth connection with the god of age, Tai Sui. Also, they say, to quote from some dodgy website, this means that you will receive plentiful support and blessings. You will encounter unexpected delights and surprises in various aspects of your life. And the monkey is skilled and intellectual, while the dragon is vivacious and strong-willed. Today's guest speaker is certainly skilled and intellectual, and if I'm not totally off, he's a monkey, at least in the lunar sign sense. It is such an honor to introduce the next legend in Reflections, Professor Richard S. Kayne. Legends is what we want, legends is what we get, and Professor Kayne is a great follow-up to Professor May from our first installment. Professor Richard Kayne is the Silver Professor of Linguistics at New York University, where he has worked since 1997. Previously, he taught at CUNY, MIT, and for many years, the University of Paris 8. He has also held a long list of visiting and short-term appointments, taught at summer schools, and given numerous lectures around the world. Among other distinctions, he is a fellow of the LSA, the Linguistic Society of America, and was awarded honorary degrees by the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, the University of Bucharest in Romania, and the University of Venice in Italy. Richard Kayne can look back at over 50 years of publishing in linguistics, or rather, we all can read 55 years of Richie's tremendous output. After earning an undergraduate degree in mathematics from Columbia College, at the tender age of 20, if I'm not fully mistaken, he received his PhD in linguistics from MIT in 1969 under the supervision of Hutch Ross. French Syntax, the Transformational Cycle, was published in 1975 by MIT Press, the first of his 7 monographs. He also co-edited an annotated syntax reader and the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Syntax, jointly with Memo Cinque, who I just saw joining us here as well. served on many editorial boards for journals and book series, and is the editor of Oxford Studies in Comparative Syntax. Over the years, Richie contributed enormously to theoretical syntax and comparative, or better, micro-comparative syntax, especially in French and Italian. 2024 signals the 30-year anniversary of the anti-symmetry of syntax, a super influential framework for syntactic structures and linearization. I'm sure we will hear something about this today, and many ideas that have sprung from Richie's great mind. So, since today marks the first talk of the new year, literally, in our online lecture series, Reflections, Foundations and Developments in Generative Grammar, let's not waste any more time, but welcome to the virtual stage and hand over the reins to Professor Richard Kayne, who will present his account of generative syntax over the years, on some changes and on some non-changes. You can find the handout in the chat. I will repost it in a second. All registered users should also have been sent a copy by email, and the handout is available in the other channels as well. So, Richie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As you can see, apart from the title, the handout begins with a question. And as you can intuit, the question is there because I think the answer to it is yes. It's not the kind of question that you can demonstrate an answer to very clearly, but it's that has some importance. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with emphasizing novelties as they come into the field, but I think there's a tendency in the field to background to too great an extent the continuity that the field definitely has. And I'll try to give some sense of that in today's talk. Clearly, the history of generative syntax dwarfs what any one person could conceivably present in an hour's talk. I'll touch on things that were important to me at certain stages, beginning with the book that Clay just mentioned, called French Syntax, The Transformational Cycle, published in 1975. As we know, publication dates can be somewhat misleading. They represent hard facts, but they don't actually tell you when the content was thought of or when the content was written down. In this particular case, and this will be somewhat important for what follows, in this particular case, my 1975 book represented an expansion of my 1969 MIT dissertation. And it was really an expansion. The book, to a very large extent, contains the dissertation, but it's sort of 2.25 times or 2.5 times as large. The book itself was actually written primarily in 1972-73, during my first years of teaching at Paris 8. Not irrelevant is the fact that I was teaching in France, in a French context, in French, with a student body that in those years was almost entirely French speaking. The fact that I was teaching in Paris then was to a large extent due to a stroke of great luck that I had in 1967-68 as I began working on my MIT dissertation, which followed immediately upon the completion of my first and last phonology paper, which was directed by Morris Halley. The stroke of luck was that Nicolas Rouvet, a prominent, very good French-speaking syntactician, originally from Belgium, the French part of Belgium, but by the the late 60s, he was already had a position in Paris. My stroke of luck was that he chose to visit MIT that year. And then, which gave me the opportunity to discuss my work with a native speaking syntactician of the language I was working on. Nicolas Rouvet, after he went back to Paris in 68, got a position in this new university, Paris, which had a department of linguistics, which was unusual for France. And he asked me to join the department in 1969, which I did. When I got there, I would sit in consistently on his syntax courses as well as on those of Maurice. It was a tremendous opportunity for me to immerse myself in French syntax. Nicolas Rouvet's syntax papers were, I think, all written in French and about French. It turns out that John Goldsmith did the field real books worth of Nicolas Rouvet's papers. The book appeared in English in 1991, as you can see in the handout. But let's get back to the novelty continuity question with a short anecdote. In the early 90s, a student of mine said that found my book, French Syntax, very hard to read. Now, of course, it's logically possible that the student was criticizing my writing style, but I think it's quite a bit more likely that the student was commenting on the changes undergone by syntactic theory in the intervening 20 years. And those changes are very real. But the question is, should that really have made work of 20 years earlier so hard to read? Well, that's not a simple question. But let me take as an example one of the transformations that I discussed in that book, the one I called L-tous, where tous is a French word corresponding more or less to all. And this transformation played a fairly large role in the book. It was stated as in one on the handout. That kind of statement is completely foreign to the current state of the field of syntax, but it was standard in the first 15 or so years of the field. The left side of the arrow in one corresponds to what was called the structural description, the right side to the structural change. Essentially, it says that if at a certain point in the derivation you see a verb immediately followed by a quantifier of some sort, then you switch the position. Okay? Current terms, you move the quantifier to the left. The verb. The X and Y are variables that won't be relevant here. An important question is what this Q stands for. In practice, it stood for a set of related quantificational elements, such as tout, tous, tous les deux, rien, chacun, also ni l'un ni l'autre. Tout corresponds pretty well to the all, which is actually no longer productive as a freestanding phrase, say, especially in subject position. Although the phrase all is well is perfectly fine, but it's a bit of a formula. And this two also corresponds to the all of that you see in three. We spent all day working. Well, I just go through some other correspondences here. One thing that's notable about French is that it readily floats complex phrases like all the two, all the three, all the four, etc., in a way that English cannot do at all with the definite article. Some English, not mine, allows sentences like seven in which you get the flavor of French case. an interesting fact I'll note just quickly in passing is that French allows the combination of all with the numeral 2 in a way that English normally does not. In French, tous les deux is perfectly ordinary, whereas in English, example 8 is bad, and in 9 you can see that there's a sharp contrast between all three students. Although there's an interesting exception that I mentioned in 10. The word rien, which goes as one of the Q elements, corresponds quite well to English nothing, although in a way that's perhaps quite important, but I won't go into it. Rien in French is not visibly bimorphemic in the way that nothing is. In what follows, I'll concentrate on tout and rien. Now, an important fact about these is that if you look at sentences in which you just have a finite verb, like 11 and 12, it looks as if these Q elements that correspond to English everything and nothing occupying the normal post-verbal object position in French. I mean, French is, VO in general in the way that English is. However, if you switch over from a finite verb to a past participle, as in 13 and 14, and then you have an auxiliary before the past participle, the normal order is what you see in 13 and 14. In fact, in the case of rien, it's really the only possible order. So you're seeing this movement, this raising of tout and rien in 13 and 14 in a way that you do not see it very clearly in 11 and 12. However, it's essentially certain that the proper way to think of 11 and 12 is that the same movement applies to these elements in 11 and 12 that applies to them in 13 and 14. The difference in appearance is due to the fact that finite verbs in French subsequently raise past the position to which the Q element has raised. This does not happen with past participles, and so you get this contrast. I'll mention in passing an important fact about French is that this movement happens with tout and with negative rien only in the case where there's no lexical noun present, and you can see that in 15 and 16. Why that's true of French as opposed to some Scandinavian, especially Icelandic, is not entirely clear even now, nor is it entirely clear why rien in French is subject to this movement in a systematic way, whereas the relatively close personne corresponding to nobody is in standard French not like that at all. So in standard French, we have 17, where the word for nobody occupies the normal post-participial position, and you cannot have 18 in standard French. Now, the early 70s, move alpha came into syntactic theory, and structural descriptions of the sort that you saw in one disappeared from the theory. But what's interesting is that although that way of stating transformations disappeared completely, the transformations themselves have not disappeared. So although the movement of tout and rien would no longer be thought of in terms of what I stated in 1 on the handout, I think everybody working on French would agree that these elements, these Q elements, do raise in a way that I discussed in certain respects back in 1975. And we can ask a familiar kind of question: what exactly does the class picked out by this raising operation in French have in common? I won't pursue that question either. if we go back to the facts of 11 to 14, we can see that it's an early example of what we can call masked movement, where the effect of one movement, in this case, the Q movement, is masked by the subsequent movement of the verb. It's an important aspect of syntax. I mean, in doing syntax, we have to be on the alert for cases like that, where we don't see the effect of a certain kind of movement right away, but it's there and it may be masked by something else. At the same time, if we compare the finite verb examples in, let's see, where in 11 and 12 with with the participial examples in 13 and 14, we can see something else, which is that VO order in 11 and 12, which, as I said, looks exactly like VO order in any random simple French sentence, has the property that in 11 and 12, this VO order is produced in a way that's different from the way it's normally produced. Normally, the verb, the finite verb French raises, as in Pollock's well-known 1989 paper, normally the lexical object in French does not raise. So if we were to take a sentence which is actually not on the handout, like Mary reads linguistics books, and we compare it to 11, they would have the same word order, but the derivations would be different, because in 11, the object raised in a way that it would not have raised in the case of Mary reads linguistics books. This is something that's extremely important. Another example of it is Matt Pearson's work on Malagasy, arguing that the notion VO, the sort of Greenbergian VO notion, is really very misleading, because different languages may produce VO as an output order in different ways. I mean, that's telling us something that we already know, which is that the Greenbergian notions, such as VO, etc., are really very superficial notions from our perspective. They pick out derivation final orders without taking into account the question of how those orders are derivationally produced. And from our perspective, that's a big lack in the Greenbergian tradition. Now we note in 19 and 20 that there are cases where this Q movement in French can move one of these Q elements past more than one verb. And if we look at 21 and 22, we can see that for some speakers, but not others, this raising of rien or tout can actually take place out of certain finite complements, in particular subjunctives. Now, this is, as I just said, 21 and 22 are cases where speakers don't have uniform judgments, as opposed to all the preceding examples. In the book, in the 75 book, called examples 21 and 22 peripheral, sort of an informal term, which is fine, but we take it just to mean not uniformly accepted across the universe of French speakers. And that's fine as long as we don't make the mistake of thinking that not uniformly accepted means of little theoretical interest. Quite the opposite is often the case. If we think of the discussion of parasitic gaps over the years, rather marginal phenomenon, speakers don't always have the same judgments about degree of acceptability, but parasitic gaps are of considerable importance to syntactic theory. And similarly, the fact the 21 and 22 are of importance. Another anecdote here that 21 and 22, my first introduction when I was teaching in Paris to the existence of sharp dialect differences within French. In fact, those differences were so sharp that in some classes in Paris in the early 70s, speakers would give the impression that they were about to begin fighting each other because some speakers say that 21 and 22 were completely impossible. And other speakers would say that they were perfectly ordinary sentences. I think that's just a familiar kind of example of how you can have very, very sharp dialect differences within a language, within what we call a single language, misleadingly, as we certainly now know. Now, 21 and 22, strictly speaking, don't fit into the structural description that I gave in one on the handout, because that description allowed the Q element to move across just V. But 22 obviously moved further, so more thinking. Another case in which the structural description and change in one was not quite sufficient is given in 23. It turns out that when you move the element past the participle, it can end up separated from the participle by an adverbial phrase like in 23. The suggestion made in the 1975 book was that the raising of Q took place in the ordinary way, just moved across V. And then there was a later rule which inserted the adverbial between the Q and the V. That's not something that we would want to do now. In fact, rule ordering played a big role in syntax in those first 15 or so years in a way that's very different from the way it does now. Pursue that. So summing up the first part of the we have an important difference in the way in which between the way in which we stated transformations in the 60s and early 70s and then 50s. We've abandoned that particular stating transformations, but we have not abandoned the transformations themselves in the sense that we would now say, well, these Q elements raise in French in this particular way. We would figure out their properties in a way that doesn't depend on anything like what I had in one on the handout, but to a significant extent, not that much has changed. That's not a very precise statement, and it's appropriate that it's not. The next paragraph just mentions a couple of things that were clear cases of progress in the field to the problems I was working on in the 75 book, the accusative hypothesis, which didn't come in until after I finished writing it, was clearly an advance in ways that I won't go into. And similarly, the subject within VP hypothesis that came in even later was clearly advanced. In addition, if you look at the history of syntax, you see a very interesting way that in the 60s and early 70s, there were lots of rightward movement rules, that were taken for granted, including in my 75 book. If you look at the history of the field, you see that the field began moving away from rightward movement in various subcases. Perhaps the most prominent one is Richard Larson's VP shell work, in which he showed that you can rethink heavy and P shift of the English sort in leftward movement terms instead of in rightward movement terms that were current before that. Clearly, that evolution away from right movement fit into my anti-symmetry proposal, or putting it another way, to facilitate the anti-symmetry proposal, which went even further in various ways. For those of you interested in doing the history of syntax, a nice example, I think, although I of course have a stick in it, would be to compare the paper that Jean-Yves Pollock and I wrote, published in 1978, on what we call French stylistic versions, not the best term, but forget that. We published this paper in 78, and then we published a later version in 2001, 23 years later. If you compare the two, it's clear that the 2001 version is much better. On the sort of minimal assumption that neither of us got any smarter over those 23 years, the improvement from the 78 paper to the 2001 paper must be due to the general improvement in syntactic theory. Now, another important property of the formulation in one is that it explicitly represents linear order, much as phrase structure rules did in the early years of the field. If you take the classic phrase structure, S arrow NP VP, you're saying that NP and VP form a constituent labeled S, but you're also giving the order NP before VP. And you could write a different phrase structure rule, S arrow VP NP, which is the same constituent structure with a different order. Linear order was just taken for granted as a basic part of syntax in those early years. Now, I think, I don't know if Chomsky would agree with this, but I think that we can trace back the movement away from the idea that linear order is, that we should just take for granted that it's a core part of syntax. We trace back this chain perspective that you see in Chomsky's recent work, in particular, to his 1970 remarks on nominalization, that is the advent of X-bar theory. X-bar theory had the notable property that it was a theory of hierarchical structure that was essentially orthogonal to considerations of linear order. That 1970 paper of Chomsky also introduced the important new proposal that passive should be decomposed into various independent subparts, but I won't pursue that. Now, Chomsky's recent work has developed much further in terms of what he calls externalization. The idea that linear order, which we should keep in mind is properly understood as temporal order, is not part of core syntax, according to Chomsky's recent work. And as he's noted, that there are connections to questions about the evolution of the language faculty. Now, in what follows, I'd like to try to convince you that Chomsky's recent take on linear order is not correct. One piece of evidence comes from the syntax of pronouns and their antecedents, in particular in cases where the antecedent does not C-command the pronoun. So here we have 24 and 25. In neither 24 nor 25 does the antecedent John C command the pronoun he. But both of those sentences are fine in English. And they give the impression that the language faculty doesn't care about linear order in the case of pronouns. Putting it slightly differently, if we think of classical binding theory with conditions A, B, and C, those conditions all have to do with hierarchical structure. Linear order plays no role. And the fact that English allows both 24 and 25 suggests, I think, to a lot of people, that linear order just doesn't matter for the question of where the antecedent of a pronoun is allowed to be. It's of some importance, and this question has not been pursued sufficiently, I think, over the years. It's of some importance that English seems not to be fully representative with respect to 24 and 25. In particular, if we take 25 and let's use the term backward pronominalization, which was current in the 60s, English in 25 allows backward pronominalization quite readily, but many other languages don't. Michel de Graaf told me a while back that in Haitian Creole, sentences like 25 just didn't work. Jim Huang, in his 98, indicates that Chinese, Mandarin, I guess, primarily, has much less backward pronominalization than English. Colette Craig, in her book on Caltech, Mayan language, says that it has no backward pronominalization at all. Probably the most striking of all is Danish, relatively close cousin of English, but there's a grammar of Danish by Allen and others that says very clearly the Danish either have none or at least much less backward pronominalization than English does. And then Jai Sheelan says something similar about Malayalam. Now, there seems to be severe limitations on backward pronominalization. The important thing is now that there don't seem to be any similar limitations on forward pronominalization of the sort seen in 24. Here's 24 again. So there seems to be an asymmetry if you focus on contexts in which the pronoun is not C-commanded by its antecedent. There seems to be a precedence, a left-right asymmetry. On the whole, to have the antecedent to the left of the pronoun is much more widely possible than to have the antecedent to the right of the pronoun, even if it's the case that in English both are possible. Now, this question of non-C command is important because if anti-symmetry is correct, then when you have asymmetric C command, you have precedence, which means that you can't really pull them apart from each other. But when you don't have asymmetric C command, you still have precedence, and they don't go together. So this case of backwards and forwards pronominalization is exactly that case. Now, a big question is whether this left-right asymmetry with respect to pronouns and their antecedents has counterparts elsewhere in the grammar. That's a question for future work. Now, so that's one argument that I'm giving in favor of the idea that linear order is part of core syntax. Because if the grammar needs to know whether the non-C commanding antecedent precedes or follows the pronoun, well, that has to be in core syntax on the assumption that pronoun antecedent relations are part of core syntax. A second kind of argument, which is more theory internal, is based on anti-symmetry. Anti-symmetry, as you know, has linear order dependent on structure. It has the idea that every rejection maps into the order spec head complement, it also requires that only one spec per projection, and you can see that that gets really interesting when you look into cartographic work, as in Rizzi 97 and Cinque 99. So the question arises, how does anti-symmetry fit in with Chomsky's externalization notion? And I think that at first glance, you could say that there's no incompatibility. If you think that anti-symmetry is correct, and you're Chomsky, you could say, well, let's impose anti-symmetry in the mapping from core syntax to PF, which is where linear order is brought into the grammar from Chomsky's perspective. There is, however, a question about anti-symmetry that I can't say much about right here. It's a rather simple question. Why would the language faculty be anti-symmetric to begin with? In 1994, in the terms of my 94 monograph, I could have asked, but didn't, why is the LCA part of UG? You can perfectly well imagine a UG that doesn't have any LCA. Now, in a later paper in 2011, I suggested that we could get the beginning of an answer to that if we took linear order to be part of merge. Now, Chomsky is very much against that. And now I'd like to touch on various reasons why he's against it. And I'd like to argue that these reasons are not convincing. In part, he takes the view that linear order is not part of core syntax because it seems not to feed differences in semantic interpretation. But the discussion of 5 minutes ago about pronominalization shows that that's probably not right in any general way. And the fact that it's right in many areas of syntax simply reflects the fact that precedence and asymmetric C command are essentially the same thing from an anti-symmetric perspective. Another reason why Chomsky has taken linear order not to be part of core syntax has to do with well-known examples that he's been discussing for a long time that show that movement, in the case of English subject aux inversion, cannot take the closest auxiliary, linearly speaking. So if you start from something like 26, where you have two auxiliaries, two instances of is, it's clear that you can't raise first one up to C position. The fact that this fact is completely clear. The question is, and Chomsky wants to it is indicating that the notion of linearly closest is not something that the grammar uses. But the obvious question that arises is whether the strong impossibility of 27 could be due to independent structural factors that has nothing to do with precedence. And so you can say, well, maybe the problem is that in starting from 26, you try to move something from inside a relative clause that was itself inside a subject phrase. And we know that you get violations such as the one in 28, where if you do WH movement from within a subject phrase, the result, in English at least, is quite marginal, but clearly not as bad as 27. And of course, in parasitic gap cases like 29, you can move something out of a subject phrase fairly readily. However, and this is a sort of key point, if instead of looking at examples like 28 and 29 in which you moved an argument by WH movement, you construct examples in which you move a non-argument, in particular an adverb, things change dramatically. So if you start from something like 30, where there's the key adverb is loudly, and you try to do WH movement to loudly, giving you 31, the result is much worse than 28. And well, it's not so easy to measure, but arguably as bad as the result in 27. Similarly, you cannot construct parasitic gaps with adverbs coming out of that kind of structural configuration. If we jump over to relative clauses, the same effect. Let me skip that and move on to this paragraph about work by Andrea Moro. Chomsky mentions work by Andrea Moro and others in a 2003 paper showing that Broca's activation does not take place when subjects are presented with a, quote, unreal language in which negation would systematically be the third word in a sentence. I mean, that's an important point, but I don't think it bears directly on the question of whether or not linear order is part of core syntax. Rather, what it shows, I think, is that the language faculty doesn't count. It doesn't count 1, 2, 3, 4. What's interesting, now Chomsky's point here is that the language faculty doesn't count, say, up to 3 with respect to linear order. But as far as I can see, the language faculty doesn't count with respect to structural notions either. So as far as I know, no syntactic operation could possibly take as its goal a phrase that would be exactly 3 nodes down from the node that you're starting with. So I don't think that Chomsky's point there picks out linear order in any way that's different from hierarchical structure. Now, coming back to this question of interpretation, verb raising, the sort studied by Pollock and others, the French sort that you see in many languages, seems to have no effect on interpretation. Now, this ties in with Chomsky's proposal from, I give it 1995 source, but it actually goes back to the 80s, this full interpretation principle, which said that everything had to be interpretable. You can imagine generalizing that full interpretation principle to the idea that movement operations should have interpretive effect. But that's been argued by a number of people that I mentioned in this middle paragraph here. And this all leads to the idea that the notion that Chomsky has at least toyed with on and off for many years, which is that certain operations that we typically think of as syntactic might actually belong in the post-syntactic part of the grammar, that is, in the mapping from core syntax to EF. The references that I mentioned in this paragraph, Matushansky, Fukui, and to an even greater extent, the paper that I did with Chris Collins recently, that paper takes the general position that there's no such thing as post-syntactic operations. I mean, you have syntax, but there's no natural division within syntax between core syntax and anything else, so that in essence, all you have is core syntax. Also, we can note that there's another kind of consideration here. We can look at verbs of the French sort and say, well, there's no obvious interpretive effect. But it's not the case that questions of interpretive effect are the only probes we have into the place of operations in the grammar. If we think back to a paper I published in '91, where I argued that infinitival verb raising in Romance has an effect on whether or not big pro is admissible as the subject of a Romance infinitival if clause. If we assume that's correct, and if we take the licensing of big pro to be part of core syntax, then it must be the case that infinitival verb phrasing in Romance is part of core syntax, whether or not it has any interpretive effects. Somewhat similar, if we look at relative clause extraposition as in 38 and 39, we can say, to an English speaker, 38 and 39 seem interpretively identical. Yet, if we look at 40 and 41, we can see that there's a very interesting restriction on relative clause extraposition in English that is almost certainly connected to scopal properties of only. But if that's true, then relative clause extraposition must be part of core syntax because interacting with scope here, despite the fact that it seems not to have any interpretive effect in cases like 38 and 39. This kind of reasoning goes back to Anders Holmberg's 1986 dissertation, where he looked at the well-known Scandinavian object shift and argued that it had to be syntactic, that is in current terms part of core syntax, because in some cases, in some Scandinavian languages, it can feed topicalization, which is part of core syntax. We can make the same argument for Romance clitic placement, but let's skip that. Let's just note, going back to work by Nicolas Rouvet, who I mentioned at the beginning, that French has a particularly interesting kind of sentence given in 45, where you can see that this clitic en in 45 corresponds to a subpart of the phrase, the first chapter, which has, because of subject-to-subject raising, ended up in the subject position of the matrix part of the sentence. But the object clitic, en, is actually inside the infinitive phrase. So the obvious solution that Rouvet developed is that you criticize the en first, and then you move the phrase, the first chapter, up to matrix subject position. But that means that clitic movement, at least in this case, has to precede a raising operation, which is part of core syntax. So the conclusion then is that syntax, in fact, syntax, because I don't really think there's any distinction between core syntax and anything else, is open to much that is not obvious and important. It's open both to semantically neutral movement operations, as in the case of Scandinavian object shift, Romance clitic placement, relative clause extraposition, verb raising of the French sort, and that doesn't bother. Similarly, it doesn't bother syntax, it doesn't bother the language faculty that core syntax expresses linear order, even though in most cases, the doesn't make any independent contribution to interpretation. I note here, footnote on the previous page, footnote 17, which just touches on something that's quite important, I think, and that is the question of the relation between syntax and phonology. And 17 just makes, footnote 17 just makes the point that silent elements of the syntactic sort are actually present in phonology in some obvious cases. In any case, coming back to the conclusion, we have, in the case of linear order, the ironic historical trajectory that in the early years of generative syntax, linear order was taken for granted as being a part of core syntax. Then Chomsky, especially in recent years, moved away from that position. I think that the field should be moving back to that position, which will then be an instance of not unbroken, but an instance of continuity in the field. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Richie.
Thank you, thank you. So if you
Okay,
can, at this point, we can stop sharing your screen. People
hope that-
applauding.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of applause for Richard. And Clay, is it you or me doing the questions? I don't remember.
I'm happy to do that. So let's just go top down the way I see them. Oops, that was Craig who had a question. Craig Tiersch. Oh no, sorry. We want to give the floor first to junior people, please. So graduate, undergraduate, postgraduate students, early postdocs. Please raise your hands first.
But Craig is more junior than I am.
Yeah. Well, it's getting tough to find other.
Okay, let's go on to
I don't want to be
truly junior
be
people.
ageist
Yes.
here, but yeah. Anybody? Any juniors? Any students? Postdocs?
Do you see
Feel free
Shuda
to-
there?
Yeah, Shuddho. This is Shuddho from Bangladesh.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed. And my question is that so far I know that generative syntax or the minimalist syntax actually is based on English language or like Germanic language, which allows like right branching in the syntax. If we draw the tree diagram of an English sentence.
Well, I don't think it's accurate to say that minimalist syntax is based on Germanic and Romance or anything like that. The languages from all over the world are feeding into theoretical discussions now and have been for quite a long time. Although, of course, it's true that if you go back to the mid-50s, everything was about English, but that was a while ago.
Yes, I got it, sir. So whenever I try to apply the minimalism in my own native language, like Bangla, I'm a Bangla speaker. Like South Asian languages like Bangla, so it always requires left branching, right? So whenever I try to apply minimalism in Bangla sentences, like there are some issues in little BP, in big BP. So I just want to know that is there any is there any way to resolve the issues while applying the rules other than English and other than especially for South Asian languages? So I just want
Well,
to.
I mean, there's been a lot of work done on South Asian languages, both of the Indo-Aryan sort and of the Dravidian sort. And for many, many syntacticians, those languages fit into current syntactic theory as well as European languages do. Obviously, they don't match exactly. And, you know, we have to understand what the parameters are that underlie the differences. But that's an exciting part of syntax. And, you know, people like you who are native speakers of languages that have been relatively less studied than some others, you're closer to being a pioneer than I am. And that's a good thing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Malha?
Hello again. Thank you for the talk. So one of the questions I've been wondering about in this general spirit of bringing linear order and things back into the narrow syntax is the increased popularity of viewing the covert-overt movement asymmetry as simply one of copy deletion at PF. And I'm wondering if your way of looking at things would predict some sort of deeper asymmetry between those two things than a copy deletion view would, and whether that could potentially actually be evidence for, treating linear order as important.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up that question. I have mixed feelings about copies in syntax. I mean, I think that the fact that there are various cases in various languages in which you see more than one copy of the same thing, provides an initial support for the idea that movement leaves behind the copy. I'm not certain that that's the only way to think about those. And with respect to the notion of covert movement in the LF sense, I tend to still think in the way that I did in 1998 when I published a paper called Overt versus Covert Movement, in which I tried to show that many cases of what had been thought of as covert movement should be reanalyzed in terms of purely overt movement. But that's a big question.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me ask all the juniors again. If you have questions, please raise your hands now or write a question in the chat. There's something in the chat. We've got a question here. Where do you... I would like to ask Professor Kayne his opinion about islands, especially strong islands. Should we set them up in the externalization component?
Well, clearly, I would favor the idea that we do not, since I don't think there is an externalization component to begin with. But the challenge of islands is a big one. And it used to be the case, there was a certain stage in the theory in the 60s and early 70s when we had the impression that there were islands and that UG was just giving us these islands, and that was that. We just had to figure out what they were, and then all languages would respect them in the same way. And that view broke up in pieces over the years. So there's almost no example of an island that is simply, whose effects are simply the same across all languages. But in any case, apart from that question, no, I wouldn't look in the direction of externalization.
Okay. Malha, you again, please.
Sorry, if I could just quickly follow up on both this last question and my question then. I was wondering if you had any particular thoughts on things like island asymmetries when, under ellipsis, the kind of amnesty effects.
I wish I had,
solution.
yeah, to the extent that I have clear intuitions about these effects, I always wonder in hearing people talk about them, how do we know exactly what was deleted? But beyond that, I haven't paid a lot of attention to that.
Thanks.
Okay. Any more courageous starting linguists who would like to voice a question or write a question in the chat? Please do so now. If not, we can go to other juniors like Craig, who was first, and then we will move on to the further juniors like Massimo and others. Craig, please. Craig Tiersch? Yeah, you have to We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Ah.
I accidentally raised my hand.
Oh, no question.
So I'll defer to the other people who have questions.
Okay, all right. So no
Okay.
question from your end. Then we can go to the next junior, Massimo.
Well, thank you for
Assuming it was not an accident.
calling me junior. That's very nice of you. So my question is the following. Rich, you mentioned the Musso-Moro classic experiment, Broca's area activation, not activated with artificial languages in which you have 1, 2, 3 words and then the negation and all that. So you had an interesting comment on that. I would like to understand better what your take is on that experiment and, having to do with, it seems to deny that the system pays attention to linear order. That's the essence of that experiment, the way it has been, interpreted so far. But you have a different approach to that experiment and consequences. Please.
Well, I think the experiment shows one aspect of linear order is invisible to the language faculty. And that is the question of, whether the word or the phrase you're looking at is the ith or the jth or the kth or the etc. The language faculty doesn't care whether something is the third word or the fourth word or the fifth word. But that doesn't mean that those words are not aligned in linear order. And I tried to make that more plausible by noting that the language faculty, as far as I can see, doesn't care about counting depth of embedding in simple cases.
Well, it doesn't
So
count.
in other words, I'm happy to agree that the language faculty doesn't do counting.
Okay.
That's all I'm happy to agree with.
Okay, thanks.
Great. The next lineup is Neil, followed by Susie, followed by Howard, please. Neil, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Richie. Excellent talk. I have in the last several years migrated entirely over to your side on the linear order question.
Thank you very much.
One of the reasons is this paper that it's on the online only version of LI at the moment. It's not in print yet, but it's by Justin Royer and it's about anti-cataphora in Mayan, and I think you might enjoy it if you haven't seen it already. My question was, I've been reflecting myself a lot and reading a lot about the history of the field recently, and that plus your talk, plus the oblique mention in your talk of recent ideas involving instances of probing and merging being triggered in an ordered fashion has led me to wonder quite idly, and I'd ask you this is my question. Could it be that what was wrong with 70s syntax was not so much the idea that syntax is serial and rule-based, but the fact that we didn't have a satisfactory formulation of what rules could look like at the time?
Well, I'm happy to agree that we didn't have an entirely satisfactory view of what rules were like 50 years ago. I'm not sure I see I mean, there were two aspects of ordering back then. I mean, one was, what was sometimes called intrinsic ordering, where, one thing had to apply after another because the other thing created the environment. The aspect of ordering, which I think was not welcome, was what was called extrinsic ordering, where you had two syntactic operations, either of which could plausibly apply, but you came in and said, oh, this grammar says no, only rule A can apply first. And I think it was correct that the field moved away from that. And when I see in some people's work in recent years that you have multiple features in a given head, and then you add the statement that, this feature has to probe first and the other feature cannot probe first, that makes me unhappy.
Thank you.
Susie?
Hi, thank you. So my question, so first of all, I also agree that the answer to your very first question should be yes. But I think there are different issues here involved, perhaps, and I would like to just bring up one question regarding the claim that linearity has to be in syntax. I somehow got stuck a little bit on the backwards phenomenalization argument you gave. And the main issue I see here is that I think it's very clear that in some, maybe many languages, backwards anaphora are impossible, and therefore precedence plays some kind of role. I think that's just an empirical fact. But what I don't think is the case, and also what the theoretical literature has pointed to, is that this doesn't show that this has to be in syntax. Now, when you go back to the works on binding, on coreference, throughout the decades that we have been looking at that, take Reinhardt's work, etc. I think it has been clearly shown that coreference and binding is something very different, has a different quality. Now, in the cases of backwards anaphora, it would be a case of non-binding, which you say as well, but of something like coreference. And Roiland, for instance, has clearly argued that those processes are not syntactic in the same way. There is the rule I that Kroczynski and Reinhardt had that said, well, you can only use coreference when you cannot do binding. So it's very clearly established, or many people have assumed it's clearly established that these are different phenomena, that coreference is not part of syntax. So there's then an interesting question, where does the asymmetry in precedence come in, that some languages allow it, others don't. But I think it doesn't really tell us anything about syntax, maybe about parsing, maybe about context. It's really a question of how these pronouns are associated with an antecedent. And there are lots of work out there, for instance, that it's a form of ellipsis, perhaps, or that it's a definite description, or that it's entirely contextual and that there's nothing going on in the syntax. So my question is, have you, for all the phenomena you looked at, is it really as clear that they are syntax? Because in the case of binding, I think it's not. In fact, it's the clearest case that the pronouns are not syntactically associated with the antecedent, and therefore the precedence relation doesn't tell us anything about syntax effectively.
Well, I mean, I mean, obviously, if you're right that reference is not part of syntax, then what you say is correct. But of course, I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, I think that all pronoun antecedent relations are part of syntax. As I argued in the 2002 paper, I think the most interesting aspect of this precedence question with respect to backwards and forwards phenomenalization is one that I didn't actually put into the handout. It's the question, how come English is so generous with backwards phenomenalization and Caltech is not? That to me is a classic comparative syntax question, and we are never, ever going to get an answer to it by putting things out of syntax. I mean, my hope is, I mean, so what I sort of said in the 2002 paper, but didn't pursue it far enough, is that the antecedent of a pronoun must always precede it at some point in the derivation. And these backwards cases of the sort that English is generous with reflect derivations in which the antecedent preceded the pronoun at a certain point, and then by sort of big phrasal movement, the pronoun got carried past its antecedent. And my hope would be, but of course this may not work out at all, is that we'll find some reason why some languages like Caltech can't access that kind of derivation.
Okay, let's move on to Howard then, please.
Hi, Richie. Thank you very much for the
Hi.
stimulating lecture. I was very pleased that you emphasized continuity in your presentation, because with you, I've always felt that certainly in the last few decades, continuity in the development of syntactic theory has been dramatically underestimated. One sort of striking example is in early minimalism, all the rhetoric was about how it was a revolutionary new approach, severely departing from all earlier approaches. And I've always felt it was a rather natural outgrowth of GB. About linear order, a second point. There's a very interesting two-page passage and aspects of the theory of syntax where Chomsky compares two theories of phrase structure. One, the kind of phrase structure rules he was arguing for that give hierarchy and linear order, the thing you talked about. But he also compares that to a theory where the phrase structure rules give only hierarchy and not linear order at all. He vehemently argues against the latter, which is sort of ironic because decades later, he dramatically reversed course on that. But you're actually suggesting he should have stuck to his guns.
We should all go back to our youth.
Right.
Okay, let the youth speak. David?
Am I counting as youth? This is really just a comment about Howard's comment. So it's very interesting in that piece in aspects. Actually, when Chomsky discusses this, and he has these set theoretic terminals essentially at the below his categories, he makes reference to a paper of Curry's and says, you know, this is this Curry stuff, and it's really insane and mad, and you shouldn't do it. So I went and looked at the Curry paper, and the Curry paper is quite a famous one about phonogrammatic and tectogrammatical structure. And in that, Curry essentially proposes merge and externalization. So I just thought that if we're thinking about continuity, there's some intriguing continuity between Chomsky's dismissal of Curry in 1967 and something that looks, I mean, not this, I mean, merge and externalization are surely better terms than phonogrammatical and tectogrammatical structure. I totally agree, but I think that there's some continuity going on there. Okay, that was just a small comment on Howard's comment.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Bob?
Okay, well, a couple of things. One is that to follow up on Howard, we published a paper in, I think it was 2012, in Cedric Brooks's Oxford collection on the roots of minimalism. So if you want to take a look and see how minimalism really comes right out of the work that preceded it, you might take a look at that paper. The other thing that I might mention is that Chomsky, Berwick, and Markley have published on Lingbuzz 3 papers on a mathematical formalization of merge and recent work. And as I understand it, there's a linguistic inquiry monograph in the works, but it might be interesting to take a look at that.
Yes, I have. It seems to me that, I mean, I can't really judge their papers, but my impression is that they started from the idea that externalization is a valid notion and didn't ask what kind of formalization you would be led to if you started from the idea that there was no such thing as externalization.
Yeah. Well, actually, another point that I might make is that in the Chomsky UCLA lectures, at one point, he says basically the generative phonology and formal semantics are also syntax. It's just mapping between representations.
Right, but that's not precise enough. There are more precise questions that need to be asked about how syntax and phonology link up with each other.
Yeah.
I certainly agree that they're broadly similar, as many people have argued, but I think that we want to actually integrate phonology into what we think of as syntactic derivations.
Yeah. Well, look, the problem for me with your proposal that merge incorporates linear order is that now then merge in various languages is different from merge, in other languages. And now we have language particular formulations of merge.
That's not true. I never said that.
Well, you said that at one point, I thought you said that, merge should include linear order.
Oh, yes, but that doesn't imply that it's different from one language to the next. I mean, I buy into Mark Baker's Utah hypothesis. I think that all languages basically merge things in the same way. And the differences in linear order that you see cross-linguistically reflect differences in applications of internal merge. In the same spirit that, some languages do WH movement in a way that other languages seem not to. Has nothing to do with the formalism of merge.
Okay.
It just has to do with the fact that instances of merge are not the same cross-linguistically. I mean, English doesn't have the French quantifier raising that I talked about in the first part of this talk. I mean, that's an important fact that we have to understand, but it doesn't bear on the formalism of merge.
Okay.
As far as I can see.
All right. Thank you. It was a very stimulating talk, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Now, there seems to be a potential fight breaking out in the chat, but let's leave it for the time being. Perhaps Neil finds the courage to raise his hand. There's another question which I'm going to read after the next question because Memo raised his hand earlier. So please, Memo.
Okay, could I? Okay.
Yes, please. Please.
Yes. Hi, Richie. Thank you very much for your talk. Hello. I wanted to go back to at the beginning of what you contrasted in French between il a tout très bien compris, il a tous les livres très bien compris, which is so I was wondering whether this is a wild conjecture, perhaps, whether rather than moving these types of quantifiers, they could be merged in specific positions, interspersed among different adverbs like complètement, partiellement, tout très bien compris, etc. What leads me to think about that, but this is wild perhaps, is that if you think of an accusative in Italian, and in out of the blue situations, the subject comes after an accusative verb. So, è venuto qualcuno, è partito Gianni, and so on. But when you take tutto, the equivalent of tout in French, then the out of the blue situation has tutto in between the verb and manner adverbs. Andrà tutto bene, and so on. I mean, many. So that led me to think that maybe this kind of more simple quantifiers could be directly merged in these positions where they appear under and the difference between tous les livres and tout would then simply, and also the Icelandic case, would then be a function of movement of the verb, which would necessarily move across the object in French, tous les livres, but not high enough to move across, I mean, the participle across tout, as opposed maybe to Icelandic, where they could not even raise above the position of the object if that object were this is what maybe is still compatible with anti-symmetry. Maybe you would not accept that if objects were actually merged in specifier positions above the verb, which would be compatible with anti-symmetry. In that case,
well,
then
I'm perfectly happy with the idea that objects are merged in positions above the verb. You could think of Larson's VP shells as one instantiation of that. But the question remains is how much does the verb move? How much does the object move in one language or another? I mean, the suggestion you made at the beginning about having tu merged in the position that you see it in is reminiscent of Dominique Sportich's proposal about pronominal clitics, where he said, well, maybe you don't need to move them from within the verb phrase. You can merge them directly in some inflection-like position, and then have recourse to movement of little pro up to the specifier of the clitic. I've often found that the most interesting, not the most, but a particularly interesting property of his proposal is that it's very, very difficult to distinguish it from the movement, from the proposal it was supposed to replace. Very, very surprisingly difficult. Now, with respect to details, although in French, simple tu acts sharply differently from tous les livres, it's not a question of simple versus complex, because complex numeral phrases like tous les deux act like tu, basically. So, but in any case, so I mean, it's worth thinking about that kind of alternative. But actually, that kind of alternative doesn't get to the question that I alluded to very quickly, which is, why is it that tu precedes adverbs like très
Yeah, that remains.
I mean, I don't have an account, but I'm skeptical about everything.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next audio video question, here's a question from the chat. Coming back to the Moro et al. Paper, the 2003 paper on Broca. If artificial intelligence based on linear order only prove language doesn't work on a counting word order, which alternative could we adopt to test if linearity is part of core syntax or not?
Well, that's a good question for experimentalists, for laboratory-based experimentalists. I mean, you'd have to spell out the externalization picture, I think, more clearly than it has been spelled out, and then compare it to the sort of more classical view that I've been taking, and then try to figure out what kind of experiment could possibly get at a way of differentiating between those two. I don't have any simple answer.
That's good. And there's one more comment. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, what is your view on the claim?
Let me finish answering the previous question.
Sorry.
I think in general, and this came up in my reply to Memo's question, when we're comparing two proposals, like the externalization versus non-externalization, but always keep in mind that one possible solution is to show that the two proposals, even though they look different, are actually notational variants of one another.
Okay.
I mean, it's a rather sobering kind of thing to think about, but in the history of physics, that's been a striking kind of question. I mean, we have the impression that, Chomsky's externalization-based picture of syntax and the one that I've been proposing are really very, very different. But I think it's reasonable to ask if it's clear that they're very, very different, or how different are they really? I mean, maybe the answers really are very different, and then maybe following up on this previous question, we try to come up with laboratory experiments that could pull them apart. But we should keep in mind the notational variant question.
Okay. So the next question in the chat is, I was wondering, what is your view on the claim that syntactic and PF operations may interleave, with PF possibly feeding or bleeding syntactic rules, like Calabrese and Pescarini 2014 on Friuli and Clitics, Martinovich 2019 on Wolof? Would this, in your opinion, favor an integration of linear order in core syntax?
Yes, because phonology has linear order under everybody's view. So the more phonology and syntax are integrated with each other, I think the more plausible it becomes that syntax has, linear order too, and that there's not a big difference. I mean, it's challenging to figure out how syntax and phonology interleave with each other, but I'm all in favor of looking in that direction. Yes.
Great. Robert, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Richie, for, as always, an incredibly interesting and stimulating talk. I just wanted to sort of comment. I also are very much in the view of the sort of continuity view of what's happened in linguistic theory over times, and particularly in generative grammar. But I think, particularly in the conversation, the remarks that have come out that how we see continuity versus non-continuity is very much a matter of grain. If we're looking at the right level of development, there is a huge continuity of thought, which I tried to bring out in my talk last time, between, what was going on in 1955 and what continues in linguistic theory to today. Although, the granularity of it is vastly, vastly different in many, many ways. I am also sympathetic to your skepticism of the sort of core syntax externalization distinction. But I think that, there is a distinction that's very close and maybe a little misinterpreted, that's very much part of the way we think about syntax. And I think it was an idea that Fiengo and I tried to develop in our book, which is, on the one hand, a notion of syntactic identity, a notion where terms, be them words, phrases, whatever they might be, are actually repeated. So, I mean, it's the idea behind the copy and delete idea. And I think what Fiengo and I tried to argue, it's the fundamental idea behind anaphora. And that's a symmetrical notion. It's an identity notion. And, if you repeat a term, it's the same term, it has the same meaning. And so, in that sense, co-reference would be, as we argued, determined by the grammar in some general way, although co-reference itself and reference itself is not a strictly syntactic notion. However, the relations that hold between these elements are also a notion of core syntax, and those relations by no means need to be symmetrical and may be highly varying from language to language. So I think that kind of view is very consistent with your train of thinking, if not in detail, but in general approach to the way we think of things, because we certainly thought both of those phenomena, that is the notion of syntactic identity, the symmetrical notion, and the asymmetric notions that lead to the actual distribution that we observe, were both parts of core syntax. So I do think your intuition here is that, that linearization or temporalization, if you will, comes from external factors. That's, again, I think that's not as insightful as trying to really think this distinction between on the one hand, what are the identity relations that hold within syntax versus, which is symmetrical, versus those that determine the relations between those elements which are identical in different positions within a syntactic structure.
Thank you.
So comment, Brad.
Okay.
Question.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great that we have the first speaker of our little series present here, asking or making a comment at the end. It's also great to see that we've got the next few speakers who will join us in a few months also here. But before we go there, before Lydia finds the closing words, are there any more questions, comments, other feedback? Either audio, video, by raising your hands or in the chat. Yes. Sudha.
Yes. Pardon me for another question, sir. So I just want to know that, is there any way to show the interface between syntax and semantics through minimalism? I just want to know, is there any possibility?
Is there any possibility of what?
Is there, sorry, sir, is there any, is it really possible to show the interface between syntax and semantics through minimalism? So I just want to know.
A lot of people work on that question. I'm not really one of them, so you'll have to find other people to discuss that with.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your questions. Are there any more? If not, then I'm going to hand over to Lydia. Norbert, yes, please.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Richie, for your great talk. I have a very small question related to sort of the last part you mentioned, sort of movement without a little semantic effect. So I was thinking, do you have any thoughts about expletive movements? I mean, because if expletives are really sort of semantically empty and sort of, I don't know, sort of, whether you can say these things, but things like it seems to be highly likely that or highly unlikely that. So cases where you sort of raise expletive pronouns. So I was wondering, could those be, or sort of, looking at expletive movements, be cases that sort of, confirm your sort of view? That is to say, you have movement, let's say, of items that sort of do not contribute much sort of to the semantics.
I've wavered for many years on the status of expletives. In one recent paper, I tried to argue that they're not semantically invisible.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that moving them wouldn't be profoundly different from moving more usual things.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Well, also I think in Chomsky's minimalist program, there is this chapter on expletives. And I think he does contribute sort of some meaning, well, the categorical meaning, because they are sort of a D property, which I think he seems to link sort of to some semantics. But what it is not completely clear to me. But I see your point. But it could be sort of interesting potential cases. The other example that I thought of is sort of Dutch R pronouns, right, which you can, as Verriemsdijk pointed out, move PP internally in Dutch, right, but you can also move them out of the PP in sort of the middle field of the Dutch clause. And I don't think there is any semantic difference whether you leave the R pronoun PP internally, right, or in the middle field. So I think these are also interesting cases of sort of, semantically neutral movements. At least I've never seen that. The only exception is the negation. And so the pronouns nergens, which is nowhere, right? Which means, so nergens op, on nothing. That's the only one that has to be moved sort of, to the middle field. It can't remain PP internally then. But the other ones, like say the neutral ER there, right? Or daar, and the strong form. I mean, it doesn't matter sort of whether they are PP internally or in the sort of in the middle field. It doesn't have any sort of, meaning consequences to my knowledge. But anyway.
Yeah, that's an interesting case. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. And Richie, there's a lot of thank you from various people in the chat. So it's been very much appreciated on all levels. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening.
All right, so let me, I had one quick question, but it looks like you all want to close. Can I still ask it?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. We're under 2 hours, so I think I can fit in. I was wondering about Germanic object shift, that it has a definiteness effect, and your French cases have this quantificational effect. And so has there been any work trying to connect the two, definiteness in Germanic and quantification in French? They seem to be maybe connectable.
Well, I think it's reasonable to try to connect them. I've never thought about that myself. Maybe in large part because the French ones are so strictly limited to the bare ones, whereas the Germanic, you don't see that in Germanic, at least not that I can think of immediately. But yes, that's a good question.
Yeah, there's more going on with French for sure, but I just thought of it as you were presenting. All right, so let me close it, everybody. Thanks so much again, Richard, for a great talk. And our next talk would be by Hagit Borer on April 20th. And we have the title now, which is Reflecting on the Generative Word. So it sounds very interesting, and we hope to see you all there. And stay tuned for the Zoom link as usual. And also before that, there is a great talk by Glow, organized by Glow, which will be by Viola Schmidt on semantics on March 15th. And so stay tuned for that as well, for more information from Glow. And until next time, I hope you take good care of yourself. Bye.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
How do I